I remember the first time that I ever shot up, and there's always someone, well, not always, I shouldn't say that, but I'd say that the vast amount of people would relate to this, that there's always somebody who's going to be your good mate who goes, I'll do it for you, I've got you, and like, I'll shoot you up, oh, trust me. And you're like, oh geez, you're such a great friend, thanks so much. Found this kind of very dark, very remote spot, and I remember, like, as I'm talking to you, I remember almost every little detail about that and those processes. And as I was cruising this morning to the beach, and I was thinking about our chat today, and I was thinking about this first moment that I ever shot up, and I was like, what was that feeling that I had? And then why did it become so appealing to do that over several years? No, it just occurred to me the feeling was.
Hey team, welcome to another podcast. Today on the show we got Lissie Turner, also known in a past life as Mel Bampton. I think I'm saying that right, sorry if I'm not. But she was the host of Triple J and an announcer on Triple J for years and years and years, so a very familiar voice to many, but has a huge story with drugs and alcohol, and was a really cool podcast and episode. Just a quick one before we jump into the show, guys. We haven't previously, but this year we're investing heavily in our content and we're opening up sponsorship opportunities. We got our first sponsor the other day, which is cool and exciting. So if you like what we're putting down and you want to pick it up and be a part of the show and support us and expose your services or products or whatever it might be to our audience, we would love to have a chat with you and discuss like the sponsorship options for the show that we've come up with. So it could be anything from, you might be like, these are just some ideas, rehab centers, you might sell health products, non-alcoholic beverages, other beverages, whatever it might be. There's heaps of different stuff that could be a good fit for the show. So if you're interested in that, drop us an email on the site with the links below. But without further ado, let's jump into the pod because it's a really cool one today. Peace, everybody. Okay, boom. What's happening, everyone? Happy New Year. It's good to be back on another show. This is actually the first recording that we're doing for the year, Lizzie. So it's good to have you on as the first guest of 2024. So everybody, we've got Lissie Turner today. How you going? How's the morning been? We've been fucking around for about half an hour trying to get the recording to work, but we're here now.
I hope that's just not a metaphor for the year that's ahead, really. But, I don't mind. I don't mind the little technology faffing around. I know that it's sort of bothersome for some people, but for me, it's like space. It's like, oh, look at all the space that we can suddenly find in our daily lives when we need to, when the technology doesn't work. And that's okay too. I'm totally fine with that.
No, I hope it's not an outlook for the year. So let's not put that out there. But how are you going? How have things been?
Things have been really well. Like people look at our lives, mine and my husband's and our kids, and they always sort of commenting about how crazy it looks from the outside. But we're just about to go into having one child left at home of 6, and we're doing this different thing this year where we're going to be living between 2 places about an hour apart from each other, so our son can go back to the school that he was at. So for other people on the outside, it's like, what are you guys doing? Like between the farm where we're regenning and now at this other little cabin back where we used to live. I'm like, you know what? This is looking like the most efficient and the most organized year, even though it's between 2 places, that I can remember having for probably 20 years. So I'm pumped.
Awesome. Now you do some really cool stuff. We'll talk about that as we go through and what it is, so people can kind of go follow it, because it is highly interesting with the farm, I believe, that you have and all that stuff. But to jump into it, I'm excited to chat to you because I actually was on your podcast. It feels like the other day. How long ago was that? Like a couple of months back now?
I have no idea. Like when you're nearly 50, time is just a time warp. I don't know. That could have been actually yesterday. But I think it was maybe 3 months ago.
Yeah. And this sounds terrible, but I hope no one's listening to this that's interviewed me. Don't take offense, but like sometimes when I do interviews, it kind of feels like going through the motions, telling your story. Like I've done it 1,000 times. But we had a great conversation around some like really interesting things around like stigma and some stuff like that. So I'm very keen to chat to you and see what goes on with your story and how you think about the whole things. But tell us why you're on this podcast. Tell us a bit about like you and your story. Give us I call it the 3-minute elevator pitch of your story.
Oh my gosh, Jack, I don't even know what the end point is. And it's funny because this year I'm thinking about writing my memoir, and it's come up quite a few times over my life, but this year feels like the year. And I was just thinking yesterday about writing to my friend who is my editor, but also a friend and a colleague, just to go, where the fuck do you start? Like, how do you find your end point on something like a memoir, and let alone in 3 minutes right now on a podcast conversation? So one of the reasons why I reached back out to you and said, Jack, can we have a conversation kind of in reverse where I get to be, at the tail end of sort of your questions and and open up the Pandora's box on my life. And I'm very much an open book, but I realize that there's actually still things that I've kept in that little place where you go, oh, that stuff's too much, it's
Yeah.
too far, it's too gritty. But there's a complete liberation in getting it all out in the open. I know quite a few of my friends are in politics, and I see how some of them keep a pretty tight container on their story, but it makes them unsafe
Mm.
because at any point someone can reach in and they can take part of that story. And if you're not prepared to have it out there already yourself on your own terms, that's a vulnerability that I think for me feels a little bit dangerous, where I'm of the notion of, I've got other friends also in politics who are just like, it's all out there anyway, so I'm going to really lay it all out on the line, and then I'm going to be free. And I think that's a really good way to live for anybody who's had a big history in drugs, alcohol, addiction of any kind, because it's the shame of the past that keeps us trapped there, that prevents people from being okay enough in themselves to leave that life behind, because put more drugs in, put more alcohol in, and you just keep bearing that shame of the things that you've done, the choices that you've made, the words that you've said, because it's too much. But when you're at a point in your story like where I am, which is quite a few years down the track, and you can go, you know what? I'm just laying it all on the line because it was an important part of my story. And that might help other people go, I'm going to go through that obstacle of shame, because that's going to help me to be free.
Yeah. It's like that. It's like the 8 Mile principle. I don't know if you've seen that movie about Eminem.
I
In that,
love that movie. Love
yeah,
it.
in that last scene, I think it's the last scene where he just kind of says all the bad things about him and about himself, and then there's nothing left for anyone else to say bad about him. Yeah.
Exactly. You become unfuckwithable.
Yeah, love it. Interesting. Okay, so well, I feel honored that we're gonna kind of pull out some of the juicy bits then, and hear a bit of the stuff. But so the thing that I want to cover off and I find interesting about you is that um, you look like someone that hasn't had any kind of a past or history. You don't to me, you don't sort of fit the stereotypical mold of what you would think about if you thought, oh, somebody has had some issues with alcohol or drugs or whatever it might be. So I
I,
don't know how
I
you
can
feel
actually,
about that,
I actually feel a little bit teary hearing that. I actually feel quite a lot teary in hearing that, because I can't even really believe that, because I think that's been part of my story for so long, even though I've been clean for 12 years. And I don't sort of see myself as necessarily that, but I was that for a long time. And I was wild in my past. Like I was famous for that. And I remember opening up this magazine once, and this international band was being interviewed. And I was reading, they were mates of mine, and I was reading this article, and one part of it said, the question was, what are you really looking forwards to about coming back to Australia? And the lead singer answered, um, catching up with Mel Bampton, which is my other name, catching up with Mel Bampton because it is completely off the leash. Like anything sort of goes in terms of our drug taking and our drinking. And I was like, oh my God, like it's in print. And there was this sort of expectation that I then had to step up to, which was interesting as I started to fade that stuff out of my life. And a lot of my didn't, a lot of my friends didn't really know where to meet me at as I started to go clean, because that was a part of the reason why they were connecting with me, is that any kind of drug and alcohol fuel adventure you could go on, I would be up for it. So you saying I don't look like from the outside that I've had any of that kind of history is so interesting to me, because I still feel like that Hogan scrapper who grew up in the western suburbs, who took way too much amphetamines in her time, drank too much booze, and probably committed too many crimes in her younger years.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting. There you go. Um, okay, so let's try and get a little bit of like a linear handle on your story. So like talk us through it. How did it start? So when you say western suburbs, is that Sydney, Melbourne,
Brisbane.
Queensland, Brisbane?
Brisbane. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I grew up in the western suburbs of Brisbane, and to reverse that even a little bit more, so both my parents are migrants,
Yeah.
Dutch and British. And, back then, no matter where you were coming from, you were put in the British got a little bit of different treatment, of course, but everybody else, they went into the migrant sort of camps until you were, I guess, sort of pushed out into where you could have housing, which was state housing, migrant housing. And so my parents had come over from their respective countries and grew up in these neighborhoods that were all migrants and all Indigenous, because that's where you pushed everybody that you didn't want in your, respectable city centres, and pushed them to the outer suburbs. And so it was, a really literally colourful neighbourhood, places to grow up in, but socioeconomically very poor, because it was all state housing. I didn't grow up in state housing. My parents did save their money and bought their own house, which I remember them telling me they bought for $17,000 their first house. It's just so crazy, and which was probably decent money at the time. But that got them out of that sort of cycle. But it was a rough neighborhood, and being surrounded by that level of socioeconomic disadvantage, lots of racial issues going on in that kind of environment, and the levels of poverty were pretty high. And so during my teen years, when I was throwing myself out into the world, and I was going further west to do that into good old Ipswich. For anybody who knows Ipswich, apparently it's been gentrified, but I find that very difficult to imagine. Uh, there's really poor pockets there. And those kids, my friends who had single mums who were really struggling, and, just getting on it was that great escape. And getting on it was whatever booze you could get your hands on when we were teenagers. And I'm talking sort of 13, 14 years old. And bulbs and butane. Like
So when you say bulbs, do you mean like nitrous?
nitrous,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
That's
So
if
that's
somebody
kind
had parents who had actually had a soda stream, and which was one person in our group. They were the rich ones who had a soda stream. And so doing bulbs, but butane was actually the big thing, because that was cheap. And that was something that I never got into, because even as a young person who was already drinking, taking acid by the time I was 13 and 14, acid was also cheap, that was readily available. Butane was that next layer down that I was like, that just screams danger to me.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
that just looks horrifically poisonous. I think with everything else, we convince ourselves with their pretty labels that they're a little bit safe. But butane, I was like, yeah,
yeah,
that's not safe. I'm not doing that. And I felt the same way years later when everyone else was taking heroin. And I never prescribed to heroin, even though I was a heavy drug taker and an IV drug user. I was like, that's a line I'm not crossing.
yeah,
Plus, I'm busy. I've got stuff to do. I'm not interested in laying around and vomiting all day. Like even then, even in my, heaviest drug taking times, I liked to live a life. And to me, that was no life.
yeah, yeah. Interesting. So you just mentioned there that you're an IV drug user, and I know this like it's a whole journey, but how quickly did that come about in your drug taking? Some people call it drug taking career, but like, was it early on in the piece, or did it take a while until you sort of picked up fits and went, yeah, I'm gonna use drugs like this?
In the scheme of what was happening around me, I was a late comer to that. Again, it was one of those things where there was a bit of a line there. Something internally for me was like, it's too far. And
100%. Me too.
I was, yeah, taking lots of acid, like I said, um, taking speed. Speed was the big thing in the late 80s, early 90s. And then when I was in high school, the last year of high school was when heroin started to come in to Brisbane and probably all around the country. And so there was a lot of IV drug use starting to come in then. But one, because it was predominantly heroin use, which, as I've said, I just wasn't interested in. And I found that sort of dangerous and scary. And funnily enough, my mum, as a testament to her, I remember her letting me watch that movie Christiana F when I was quite young. Like, I would have been in my teenage years. And I don't know if you've seen that movie, but it's one of those really iconic heroin movies, and it's terrifying. And I think because the lead character, she's a young girl. She's really not even a young woman yet. And the pathway of her drug use and that story in that movie just stuck with me so much. And I think it put into me the fear of heroin that was really valuable to me and got me through those times and got me through those cultural times where I was like, no way. Haven't
Mm.
you seen that movie? Like, I know where this goes. And then watching it actually go to all of those places and sometimes worse only reaffirmed that not for me. So because the IV drug use around me was predominantly heroin, that also kept me away from using needles, and I avoided it all the way through my Brisbane years, and then I moved up to far north Queensland. I moved to Cairns from Brisbane. I'd been in trouble with the law quite a bit. I was in the courts quite a lot, mostly for possession of weed, and which was pretty normal for all of us. Again, it's that thing of whatever you're surrounded by, it's not kind of scary to you because it's just the nature of life.
And is it the same? Was it the same back then? Because I know now, um, Queensland has much harsher like drug possession laws than like I remember that from when I was using drugs. Like if you went to the Gold Coast for a holiday or something, everyone would be like, fucking just be like careful with like drugs because they kind of compared to Melbourne, they sort of were like a lot tougher on you. Just even if you just had like a gram of weed or something, like they would just yeah. Was it like that back then, or was it just kind of level across the board?
No, but because you've got to, like, back then, which only just coming out of off the back of a Joh Bjelke-Petersen government, which was heavily fascist, very authoritarian. There was curfews. It was a heavy time to grow up in Queensland. And Joh Bjelke-Petersen he must have been a premier of Queensland. Like, he was premier for 16 years, nationalist, and until I was about 16. So I think all of my childhood years was this, fascist authoritarian regime. So even though that suggested everything is going to be harsher, what it also meant is because of that level of heavy handedness within the police force, hand in hand went corruption. So it was a
Yeah.
very corrupt police force, which is, come back into the narrative again just recently with the death of Roger Rogerson. And but everybody knew about that kind of corruption within the police force. So yes, you'd get definitely get done a lot for whatever you were doing. You'd get picked up. But say you got picked up for an ounce of weed,
Yeah.
you would go in front of the courts for 1.5 grams.
Yeah.
Where has the rest gone? And no one ever argued it because it's like, well, I'm not going to stand in front of the magistrate and say, hang on a minute, the cops actually got me for an ounce, not 1.5 grams.
Yeah, of
The cops
course.
have taken my weed. You're just like, great. Like, although, there was part of you inside just going, this is so not right ethically. But I'm also, instead of standing in front of a magistrate for an ounce of weed or a pound or whatever you had, was 1.5 grams. Great, just keep your mouth shut and go with it. So that was happening at the same time as well. And I think when your systems are like that around you, and you're also living in an environment culturally out in the western suburbs where crime and drug use is more normalized, this becomes self-feeding, a bit of a self-feeding loop of normalization out there. So, but coming back to the IV drug use, so I'd been in trouble a few times and in Brisbane with the law, and I decided it was just time to get out of there. And there were friends of mine who had pretty heavy heroin addictions, and they were like, "Got to get out of Brisbane. Where should we go to get out of this heroin scene?" So somebody had the bright idea that where we should go was to Cairns, and not realizing that the heroin scene up there was just as bad, if not worse. I imagine up there, I mean, I don't know where it was all coming in from, but, there's a lot of remote coastline up there too. And the heroin scene was very, very strong up there. In fact, that's where I probably experienced the most deaths of drug use around me than anywhere else. And it was
Wow.
horrific. People with young people and young mums and young dads and who were dying in the parks and with their kids next to them, and it was bad. It was really bad. So but
Do you think, like, sorry to interrupt, just as like a side thing, because we hear a lot about, like methamphetamine now, how it's worse or it's bad in rural areas kind of across the country. Was it the same back then with heroin, or do you think it was more just kind of a product of, yeah, being close to the coastline and that's where the drugs kind of came in and stuff like that?
I always had this theory that, and I don't know whether that stands true now, because our life is different in terms of the way that we're connected to each other, much more egalitarian because of technology. But before, I genuinely believe that the further that you moved away from a metropolis centre, a metropolitan area, the more outlawish things naturally became. And that was
Yeah,
across all levels. You moved further away from the cities because you wanted to be away from the systems that were always watching you. That
yeah,
wasn't obviously the only reason, but I think that was a big part of it. And Cairns is a long way from Brisbane.
yeah,
Even though itself became a city over time and it's a big enough centre on its own, it was properly outlawish then. And I experienced the same thing when I went over to Western Australia, that even though Perth itself is the capital city, but because it's so far from this, what I suppose the East Coast considers itself to be that metropolitan hub of Australia, Perth, and certainly as you get more and more remote Western Australia, and I lived in some fairly remote places, the more outlawish it became, because people wanted to be away from those systems. They wanted to be away from that kind of tight feeling of authority and live a bit more freely, which I'm not sure is really possible at all anymore.
yeah, yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you. So you're in Cairns.
Oh yeah.
Uh, things are
So I
bad.
mean, I'm in Cairns and everybody's kind of doing their heroin thing, and I'm like, boring. When all your mates are just sleeping and spewing the whole time. Like I really struggled with that. And so I was just kind of busy doing my own thing. But I remember the first time that I ever shot up. And there's always someone. Well, not always, I shouldn't say that, but I'd say that the vast amount of people would relate to this. That there's always somebody who's going to be your good mate who goes, "I'll do it for you. I've got you." And like, "I'll shoot you up. Oh, trust me." And you're like, "Oh, geez, you're such a great friend. Thanks so much." And so there was this person, and we were in this really awesome old HK station wagon. And I was living in Kuranda at the time. I went up there with a lot of hours of community service from my police trouble in Brisbane. I had
Yeah,
like 900 hours of community service or something like that. And so I had to go up there and get that all sorted out. And one of the places where I could do my community service was on the Aboriginal missions up there,
yeah,
which means I could hang out with my Murray mates up there on the missions. and we'd, do a bit of regen, pick up rubbish and whatever. So I was living in these pretty wild places in Kuranda, like deep in the rainforest up there and in the outskirts of Kuranda. And this one night, we'd got some amphetamines, got some speed, and one of my friends was like, "Tonight's the night, Lissy." And I was like, "You know what? I think it is." And I don't know what that turning point was. And we went for a drive in this HK and we we're going deeper and deeper and deeper into the forest. And I don't even know where we were. We're just driving on this dirt road, I think heading north from Kuranda. So we're in the mountain, on the mountain. Found this kind of very dark, very remote spot. And I remember, like, as I'm talking to you, I remember almost every little detail about that and those processes. And now, as I was cruising this morning to the beach and I was thinking about our chat today, and I was thinking about this first moment that I ever shot up, and I was like, what was that feeling that I had? And then why did it become so appealing to do that over several years? No, it just occurred to me the feeling was.
Hey team, just a super quick interruption to the podcast to let you know that no conspiracy, but because of the content that we share, we do get shadow banned on some of the platforms just because of the graphic nature. No conspiracy or anything like that. So if you want to have the real, raw, uncut conversations, we have a free newsletter called the Good Gear Newsletter. In the newsletter, we talk about how to build people's AOD careers with interviews and different stuff with professionals in the space. We talk about policy change and, topical issues relating to alcohol and drugs. And we also have some stuff in there for people on how to beat addictive patterns and change things up. So if that's of interest to you and you want to have the real, raw, uncut conversations, subscribe to our free newsletter. We would love to have you there and have the two-way conversation. Now back into the show, guys. Peace.
Was relief.
Yeah.
So weird. It was this, like, it wasn't sort of, fireworks and all this stuff. There's this, like, all permeating, just lovely feeling of relief. And I realized that the relief was the relief of not feeling afraid for a moment, the relief of feeling like, oh, just landing in my own body somehow, this relief of feeling empowered, falsely so, of course.
Yeah.
But this feeling of being empowered and not fearful, and like it wasn't this kind of blowing the top of my head off high. It was this steady, stable sense of relief, of all the fears just falling.
Sorry, it just cut out. So it cut out at an okay point because you finished on relief. So the question I want to ask about the relief, do you think that it was relief from all these, like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, tell me if it's wrong, but like the unconscious kind of fears and feeling unsettled and unsafe from that kind of environment that you were brought up in, and everything that kind of flowed on from there, or was it something else?
I grew up in a really, my family was totally, white bread and butter and safe and all of those things. But there was definitely that sense of not belonging, not belonging in my family, not belonging in my school, not belonging in my community. And so for me, there was no this sort of major trauma scenario. There was drinking came first. And because that's just what happens. But I just got into that very, very early. And again, the drinking probably did a similar thing where it was that feeling of relief from the worries about how you do this life, the worries about how do I fit in, the worries about do I look the right way, the worries about not getting it right, and all of those things that as kids we just shouldn't be worrying about. We should be, of course, we need guidance of how to do this earthly world and this earthly life. But because when we come from this sort of punitive approach of if you get it wrong, you get in trouble, so often getting in trouble for things we didn't even know were the wrong things to do until we did them, and then somebody got angry, whether that was at school or whether that was at home or wherever. And then that just makes you retreat because you're walking around going, oh, well, what other things are not right that I don't even know yet that I'm going to get in trouble for? So you're just retreating and retreating. And I think the alcohol was the first real relief from that. And then that alcohol life, particularly if you grow up in the western suburbs, goes into the butane life, which wasn't my life, but that was around me. But it certainly went into acid life for me. Acid was everywhere, and that's a whole other level. That's different to alcohol, which is obviously if you're getting shit faced, it's pretty extreme.
Yeah.
But acid is, when you take acid, you disappear into another universe. And that feeling of being free, like a kid free, like when you're a little kid and you've got all of your imaginings and you're daydreaming and you're not caught up in all the heaviness of adulting and all of that stuff. Acid for me was, I guess, probably a returning to that. Like, oh, I feel so free. I feel so
Yeah.
amazing. Not always, because obviously, some acid trips are pretty awful. And then there's that one thing, just going to the next thing, going to the next thing. And I think you
Yeah.
and I talked about that. Like before you know it, like on your journey, before you know it, where you are is somewhere that was a long way from the person who didn't do any of those things.
Yeah,
It's just
I
also
think it's really
pervasive.
interesting. The thing I want to ask you about, because I have this conversation with a lot of people at the moment. There's this whole, which is amazing and it's really good because it's broadening the conversation and helping a lot of people. Because I think it is the case for a lot of people. But you kind of mentioned that there was no massive trauma that sort of precipitated this like use of drugs and alcohol. It was one thing leading into another, as you kind of explained it. Like, do you still see like some of those things for you as like trauma? Like, do you kind of subscribe to that thing of like all sort of like addictive behaviors and patterns are as a result of trauma? Because I think it's a relief for a lot of people to hear. Because I talk to a lot of people after we do these podcasts. They'll get in contact and they'll say like, I haven't. A lot of people have, but then a lot of people also haven't had some major traumatic event happen, but they've still ended up in the same places and are confused as to why they're in the position they're in, things like that, So
Which
it's,
you
yeah,
definitely can't understate the narrative that's all around us, particularly around drinking, because drinking's obvious is commonly where this all begins. Because the narrative is this is what you do if you're going to be a grown up. This is part of your coming of age, and that narrative is changing at a rapid pace, which is amazing. But certainly for my upbringing, this is what the adults did. And when you're a teenager, all you want to be is grown up. And well, I can springboard to that grown up state by doing the things that grown ups do. And one of those things is drinking. And it's totally acceptable. You might be telling me that I can't do it until I'm 18, but that seems like a kind of technicality. And so I'll just do it now and then I'll be more grown up. And when you start doing those things, of course, they then can bring about the traumas that then reaffirm greater and greater drug use. So I absolutely agree that, of course, we didn't need a trauma to go into these things. It was just the normal thing that you did. It was always going to be a part of your life because that was what you did as an adult in Australia. You drank alcohol, and the drugs were not that much of a sidestep if that's the kind of environment that you were in and that was all around you. So absolutely, I think it's a really important thing to talk about so people don't feel more shame when they don't have this big thing to kind of pin it back to. Like it was
yeah,
a natural process for most of us because that's what we were being told and sold was going to be part of our adulthood. You vote, you drink and you smoke durries. That's what adulting means. And you pay bills and you have a pretty unhappy time. That was
yeah,
the narrative that we were being sold. And what made adulting better and the pressure of paying those bills and having a job and having all those responsibilities, what made adulting okay was drinking and smoking durries. That's how we get through. And then you come to the end of your life and you die.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, like I said, those things snowball. And if drinking unleashed something in you that felt like freedom or feels like comfort or feels like belonging or empowerment, you're naturally going to want to stay in those states. And every time you drink, it's that little precipice moment, right? Where you have your one or two and you're like, oh, it just feels so great. You're in that space, but then you try to maintain that over the course of forever, like over a whole night until you're either spewing, you're unconscious, or if you're very lucky, you've just fallen asleep. And, but throughout the course of that night, you keep drinking or doing more because you're trying to stay on that, in that beautiful little zone where you just feel great. You feel
Yeah.
empowered or you feel uninhibited. You feel socially free of any anxiety, all of those things that we haven't learnt to do without the booze. And yeah, so I think having a very normal lead in, by that I mean not dramatic, untraumatic lead in, was almost inevitable for so many people because drinking was always going to be a part of your life because, well, what kind of freak were you if you didn't drink?
Yeah. So interesting. I actually I didn't realize it at the time, but I think it's really empowering to know that it can just be as a result of like, patterns kind of stacking on top of themselves in like snowballing in a negative direction or in the wrong direction. Because then you know that you can get patterns happening in the right direction. And I know that you have a program kind of centered around on teaching people how to do that. We can talk about that more. So, but yeah, I just I think you're right. It's such an interesting point and important point that I always want to talk to people about, and why I love having conversations with people like yourself, which we'll talk about in a minute, that have had these like amazing careers and done all this stuff while all these things are going on, and kind of in some ways are like very normal, but have all this like stuff that's going on in the background, because there's so many people out there that listen to the show that relate to that and go, and it's not disparaging if you have had those big things happen in your life. It's just everybody has a different story, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that big kind of event that pushes you into doing things. Yeah.
And can I just say as well, like, to be completely honest, is that I can also see, I'm 50 this year. There's a bit of hindsight now about things, but being clean for 12 years of things, and I really commit to my health, and that's my mental health. I'm really focused on this. How far can we expand our minds in these really clean and clear directions? But I can honestly say now that in when I look back and I think about these stories and what I can feel inside myself, I can feel that part of me that loves still to be taken to those huge spaces
Mm.
that alcohol, drugs can take you. That's actually a part of my personality. And I'm not talking about an addictive personality because I don't prescribe to that language at all,
Yeah.
because we are all made up of patterns. And we generally use that kind of language because somebody is hooked on something that socially we've decided is not okay, compared to somebody having the same hooks to the same extremes, but around something that might be more socially acceptable. So that to me is garbage. But that wanting to unleash, that wanting to dance for hours on end, that wanting to go on crazy adventures, that like feeling within me, that was the same part of me that connected to drugs and alcohol. I can acknowledge that that is a part of me, that is a part of my personality. So if I listen to the music that I loved back then, for instance, which I don't really do anymore since I left Triple J, I I didn't I rarely go to gigs anymore. I rarely do all that big stuff in my life that I was doing before. But if a song comes on that stirs me in that way, that same part of me that just wants to live life enormously,
Yeah.
I can feel it. Starts to wake up, and I'm like, that, ravaging ferocious, hungry beast that wanted to take all the drugs and drink all the things. That's a part of my personality, but now I just put it into other things that aren't shit for me.
Yeah. Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. So, because I want to go back to the story, but because I think it's interesting, I just want to ask you before I forget about it. How have you gone about combating that? Because I have that as well, and have just kind of learnt to accept that that's kind of a part of me. Not that it has to come out in drugs and alcohol, but there is that part of me that is like a little bit wild. And like, how do you do it? Do you sort of shut it down? Do you, as you just said, then do you channel it into other things? Is it about having like a big project that you're doing, or like, yeah, like how do you sort of combat that so it doesn't, I guess, get channeled into maybe some of the stuff that has negative impacts on your health and your life?
Big projects are absolutely essential for me. Doing things differently all the time are really essential for me, as well as good routine. So those two things have to coexist, otherwise it's just chaos. So having good daily routines, so making sure in the morning when I get up that I consciously move my body to whatever strength or agility, like always meeting my fullest potential on any given day. Some days that looks like just laying down and doing some good breathing because I might be a bit wrecked. But other days, if I feel that that energy is really big, then in my conscious movement based practice, the gestures, the postures will be much bigger to land more deeply in my body. So that part of me that I've actually learned to love so much, that big energy part of me, is all going in the same direction of like, right, what am I doing today? Then having those, and I generally need several big projects. So, for instance, we've got a 35-acre regen project on really degraded agricultural land. So, this
So
ticks
cool.
away in the background. So, I've always got something there that I can have no gaps. So, if there's gaps in other things in my life where my mind might be getting a little bit bored or restless with that, always landing back with the project. Excuse me, sorry about that. So there's always trees to plant. There's always organisations to contact. So that can tick away for however long I've got that. That can tick away underneath everything. I prioritise my good health. And at the moment, how I refine that is I'm prioritising strength as I approach 50. I'm prioritising refining that to be more about strength. So when I'm doing my conscious movement practice, that part of me that's big is now getting channeled into how do you make yourself stronger. Like I mentioned at the beginning, looking at writing my memoir this year. So I've got something at that layer of my brain that's being taken care of. So there's always somewhere that can be finding the edges of my fullest potential in a well commanded way, for the
Yeah.
most part, in all of these multifaceted areas of my life. And I know other people look at it and go, oh my God, it's just, I just am exhausted even looking at you. And probably without a doubt, I would be one of those late diagnosis ADHD people, but I also don't prescribe to that either. I see this part of myself as being incredibly advantageous. It is the energy of action, but I'm responsible for how I contain that so it's not chaos and carnage for myself and everybody else by going in all areas of my life. Well, what's the edge of your fullest potential? Find that. And what are you working on now? Okay, great. That's somewhere to direct your energy. So there's never this restless, dangerous energy that previously, because I didn't know how to wield it,
Mm.
and I was trying to fit into these narratives of how adult life was supposed to look like whilst heavily rebelling against them, it was easier to just kind of drink and take drugs and chant, like get that big energy out in those ways that made me feel alive and then terrible. Whereas now, if I find the fullest edges of my potential in all of these other ways, I just get to feel alive without the bad bits.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting, and it's this. It's kind of the same advice that I give to people as well. You have to not that it's a solution, but you do have to find other avenues to channel that energy into. So take us back. So we stopped it. You had your first shot. You felt the relief. By the way, when you were explaining that, I was like totally in my head thinking about my first shot. And like just like fully I was listening to you, but I was like just running it through mine in my head. So sorry, trigger warning for everybody out there if you're thinking about yours as well. But so that happened, and then we just off to the races, like, and it was just kind of all in.
It's funny how much I can remember that first shot, but not a lot after that.
Yeah.
I remember bits and pieces of it, and I remember, always at the needle exchange, and I remember, this bedroom in this house that I live, which is essentially this, closed off part of a garage underneath a house that I lived in Cairns. House was beautiful, but there was just heaps of us living in it, and somehow I ended up living in this Besser block shed part of the garage, and just all along one wall, the entirety of the wall was just all my fit packs, just full of used fits. And because every now and again you can't get to the needle exchange and you've got to reuse, and and it's just disgusting. Oh God. And some of the things I'm like, oh, sorry to everybody who's listening who, is being triggered by this again, but I think it's also good to be able to talk about this stuff and actually go, oh,
100%.
it was so gross. It was so gross. So there wasn't, I'm actually just trying to piece this together. I mean, perhaps it was a little bit right. Let's go. I rarely remember after that taking amphetamines in a different way. Like, I
Yeah.
think that just became my way for several years. And it was interesting. I was thinking about this recently when I was sitting in a Triple J editing studio in Sydney. So from the time of that first shot to then was probably 7 or 8 years later. And so
Yeah.
I would have stopped shooting up already by 2 or 3 years. I think that was maybe about a 5-year part of my life. But I remember sitting in this editing booth. So you're in the dark and I'm working on something or recording something. And that overwhelming feeling of getting on it in that way. And I was still taking drugs, but I wasn't taking drugs in that way. I was just taking ecstasy and MDMA, and the needle use had fallen away somewhere along the way. I'd had a child in between that first taste and when I'm talking about now. So obviously that was a very large part of the
Yeah.
changes, but it didn't fall away immediately. But that started to break it all up, and I needed to make some very big changes. But by the time she came along, that had become a very minimal thing to do rather than the normal way to do it. But it was interesting these years later sitting in this Triple J studio and just getting that overwhelming urge, and my mind going, I'd lived in Sydney for about a year and a half already, never had this thought, but then thinking, I wonder where the needle exchange is.
Wow. Yeah.
And then going, ah, yuck. Like, where did that kind of come from? But it was just fascinating to me to see that sort of jump up. So definitely the needle use was pretty prevalent, and those, as you and I spoke about, and anybody who has gotten into a bit of a rhythm with needle use, your integrity in terms of your self integrity and how you will carry yourself through the world and the choices that you'll make, that really lowers exponentially. And
Yeah.
I don't know why that is. I really have thought about this a lot, why that kind of goes hand in hand. Like, I remember this one night in the valley, and I was out and I was on the booze, and I wasn't planning on, using in any way that night. But then at some point through the night, you have that thought, like,
Mm.
oh God, it would just be good to have a taste right now. And I remember, I can't believe I'm even going to share this story. I'm just contemplating whether I do or not. Fuck it, let's just do it. Let's go back to what I
Okay,
said in the beginning about it all out.
let's go.
So I remember asking around everyone in this bar. And I would do this all the time. Like as soon as I felt like some drugs and I didn't have any, I just presumed that the whole world took drugs. And I would ask everybody, have you got any speed? Have you got any speed? Have you got any amphetamines? Have you got everybody? Like there'll be so many people who probably weren't even drinking, who are super straight, super conservative. And I'm thinking, everybody takes drugs. So I'm going around a whole bar until I find somebody who goes, yeah, I've got some. And I remember this one night, there was these two older guys. This was in the valley through this time where the valley was like the valley back then. Again, the times of it's pretty corrupt, pretty loose, pretty gritty, pretty dangerous. And these two way older guys, like I probably was 19, 20, and asking them, and they were like, yep, we've got some. And they were probably in their late 40s. So they seemed like they could have been, 80 to me as a 19-year-old. And I'm like, great, I will have sex with you if I can have some of your drugs.
Yeah.
Right. And so we go back to their hotel room, and I never had any intention of giving them sex. There was no way. But this was the alcohol of the night. This was elevating into that place that was dangerous and reckless. But there was no way. Like that was not my thing. I was quite empowered when I was drinking in my body, in my sexual behavior. I felt very empowered in that. But here I was leveraging the possibility of that as currency. But the whole time I'm like, okay, I'm going back to their hotel room. I'm going to use their drugs. How am I then going to get out of there?
How am I going to get out? Yeah.
How am I going to get out? And I mean, you would know, right? When you're in those circumstances, how many times are you thinking, all right, I'm going into this with a bit of a plan, but my whole mind is, how am I going to get out? And as a young woman, you are thinking that all the time because
Mm,
you are in constant danger. If you pass out somewhere, if you're not with your people, you can almost presume that the worst is going to happen to you.
yeah.
And you're going to wake up, and that's going to be a circumstance of that. And then you're just going to get up and perhaps use again that day and just put it behind you. But I had enough of my wits about me to go, I want their drugs. There's no way I'm having sex with them. How am I going to get out? And so as that process is happening and I've gotten what I've wanted, I just the whole time I'm in there, I'm navigating where's the door, where's the position of my being, my body. I've got to make sure that as we go in, I'm positioning them there, and I'm always between them and the door. So the door is always closest to me. And I remember getting out of there, somehow getting out of that room with some kind of lame excuse, but being so confident. Oh, yeah, yeah, I'm coming back. I'm coming back. And then just running for my life. And mind you, then by the time then that I was out of there, it was also daylight, which is a whole other thing. You know, when you've been partying all night and nighttime feels like one thing, and then daylight feels like something so horrifically different.
Yeah.
And I remember being relieved because I was safe and I had gotten myself out of there. But that story, like even as I tell that story, which I don't think I've ever told anybody, probably not even my husband, I feel that like gag reflex in my throat
Yeah.
of the narrative that I was willing to put forwards to get those drugs and the danger that I was willing to put myself in. But some part of me also going, wow, your confidence to navigate that situation was quite impressive, but it's an uncomfortable story to tell. And I've thought about that a lot over the years, and just it's one of the stories that's held me in a cycle of shame,
Yeah.
particularly when things started to become really challenging for me as a mother with my own daughter and watching her experience in going through a drug use life. That stuff haunted me,
Yeah.
absolutely haunted me. But I mean, I didn't have a child then. I wasn't a mother. I wasn't making those decisions then once my daughter came along. But yet it still made me feel so icky. And but I was that was just, again, like you said before, one thing leading to another.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. It's super interesting, and stuff that I think is really important to share, just particularly from that female perspective. Obviously, I'm a bald white guy, and I know the sort of um, feeling of stigma and discrimination. But then I can kind of see how it's like it can be next level for like women and females that are going through that drug use, situations that you just find yourself in. It's very dangerous, I imagine, and you're constantly just alert. And I imagine there'll be a lot of people listening to that like go, wow, and relate to it, because you don't often hear those stories, because there's like, it's funny. I think I heard I always mess up her last name, but Jenny Valentish, I think I've said that right. She talks about that a lot, or I think I read it somewhere in a book. But like it's kind of like almost the things that the guys do in addiction in one way can kind of be considered cool, like tough gangster kind of stuff. But then the stuff that might stereotypically happen for females and women is stigmatized and shamed in society. It's just a really interesting dynamic. So I actually wanted to ask you, if it's not too personal, just tell me if it is and we can move on to the next thing. When you're going through drug use and then you're engaging in health services, with like the pregnancy and stuff like that, what's that experience like? Did you experience like a lot of stigma and discrimination, and was it hard to get support and help and stuff like that as a young woman going through that experience?
So when I fell pregnant, as soon as I found out I was pregnant, I stopped doing all the things. Like the only thing that took me a while to give away was weed,
Yeah,
and but I was also of that narrative that that was okay. Like now when I look back, I would be thinking that the smoking of that was the more dangerous part than the substance itself.
yeah,
Like if a woman was taking CBD oil, even if it had some THC in it, and that was necessary for some other health reasons, and that was being done consciously and responsibly, I would, there'd be parts of that that could be quite positive. So as soon as I found out, though, I pretty much gave up everything. Although there was one, really, I found myself in quite a dangerous situation when I was quite along my pregnancy. That meant for my own safety, because of the characters that I were with, who were quite high level drug dealers, who had quite a distrust of everybody. I did find myself in one circumstance where I had to indulge in something, otherwise I was potentially not going to get out of that situation okay. And again, it was interesting that one night when that happened, I vomited all night and had diarrhea, the whole lot. And I was so grateful to my body that was just like, get this out. It's not something that I wanted to do. It was something that I was literally forced into doing. And my body was like, no, just vomit, through everything. And I'm like, good, yes, get it out. So apart from that, through that first pregnancy, and I was only 21,
yeah,
I was a baby having a baby. And I remember when I fell pregnant, I'll get to the health services in a moment, but one of the things that shocked me was I started to hear this narrative that was coming in from my friends when I was like, I was so happy to be pregnant. I was so happy. I was like, this is amazing. I'm growing a baby. This is amazing. And I was wild. And, my face was covered in piercings, and, I had wild colored hair, and I was living in these wild feral places in far north Queensland. But I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be a mum. This is amazing. And I started to hear this narrative filtering in from my peer group, which were a pretty loose peer group, going, can you believe that Mel's pregnant? Mel's having a baby. Like, she's such a trash bag. How is
yeah.
she going to have a baby? And some of this was making its way back to me. And I was, you might laugh, I was shocked, Jack, to hear people saying this stuff about me. Like, talk about delusional, because it was so normal. I thought everybody was at the same level as I was, which many of them were and worse, but there was a whole lot that weren't. So those that weren't and could see where I was at were like, this is bad. This is really bad. This is bad for this baby. And I was so offended. I was so offended. So fucking delusional about where I was at. But I also knew that I would make changes. Like, of course, this baby's going to come first. But what that meant from how far down that path I was still not meeting, a level of what I would consider these days, like having birthed 3 children and across 27 years, was
Yeah.
an acceptable place to be, even though it was a far improvement from where I had been. So, in terms of health services, being in far north Queensland helped, I think, because it's pretty loose up there. Like I said before, there's a lot of wild characters that they would have been seeing, and I was clean then through my pregnancy, and I think it was obvious even to those health services that I really wanted this
Yeah.
baby. I really, this was a bit of a turning point for me. And I've said so many times in interviews in my life that she really did save my life. My daughter saved my life. And I know that that's not a new story. There are so many, particularly women out there, I think, who once they've got their baby coming, what they couldn't do for themselves or weren't even thinking about doing for themselves, they can do for their babies. And I did do that. The drinking once she was born was far too heavy. And then, as one of my big things when she was born was like, right, I've got to get a good job. I've got to get us a house. I've got to do all these things. And I really put my head down and focused on those things, which also meant that for a lot of her childhood, I wasn't, I was absent. I decided to become a radio broadcaster when she was just a baby.
Mm.
And again, coming back to the big energy, that also meant that I was big in the drug and alcohol world, meant that whatever that I applied myself to would get all of my energy. And within a very short space of time, I had this phenomenal job as a radio broadcaster, but meant that I was away from my little one a lot, and in an industry where drug and alcohol use was okay. Not like I had been using before. That wasn't okay. Like, Triple J cleaned me up, because Triple J wasn't like, even though it's kind of the edgier of the broadcasting music stations, it wasn't edgy like I was edgy and where I'd come from.
Yeah.
So it actually cleaned me up.
Yeah. So interesting. So it cleaned you up, but you were still engaging in, like, I imagine, drinking a shitload and, I don't know, doing what people would call like party drugs and stuff like that throughout that time. Is that, would that be fair to kind of say?
Yeah, and I think as you get cleaner, and with the drugs, I think that happened a bit more incrementally. With alcohol, it was a lot more definitive. Like, the night that I stopped drinking was the last time that I ever drank. And I think with the drugs, I gave up the IV drug use. I only used a couple of times again in that way, after my girl was born, over the next couple of years, but only very infrequently. So that had started to fall away, and then that moved more into more respectable drugs. And actually, you just made me think about it from that perspective. I remember then when that moved into cocaine use, of
Yeah.
how I was like, look at me, I'm so grown up now.
It's so funny.
I'm so mature. Like, I use cocaine now. I'm sophisticated, and I'm a proper successful adult.
I had
Isn't
that.
that ridiculous?
That's so funny. I had that thing as well. To be honest, I remember like when I got sober, I went through 12-step programs, and I remember listening to a couple people's story, and yeah, they used cocaine, and like, I don't know, they lost their job or something, which is, which is like bad, and it's, people's problem. But I remember thinking like, what the fuck's wrong with you? You're like totally fine. You're just snorting cocaine. Like it's all good, you know? Like
You've made it. You've
that's right.
made it. Why is it falling apart for you? But it's that the further you get away from the worst times, the further you get away from that, the more you start to see like, oh, okay, right, that's pretty shit. Like like where you and I are right now, and
Yeah.
we're laughing about how we had cocaine as the pinnacle of having your shit together.
Yeah.
And now looking back, going, that is just absurd. And it's why alcohol is one of the most pervasive and long-standing, because that's so acceptable.
Yeah.
You really have to come a long way, I think, down that road to see and be able to talk about how incredibly corrosive alcohol is, if not the number one,
Yeah.
because that's so normalized.
100%. 100%. Okay, so you you're got the awesome broadcasting job. Things you cleaned yourself up to an extent. Things are moving in the right direction. What I think you said that you've been completely clean, and I don't know, that's like sober as well for 12 years. What was sort of that end moment like? What happened? How did you get to the decision where you just wanted to, yeah, be completely sober from all drugs and alcohol? I think, yeah.
Sorry, Jack.
It's all right.
There's this, speaking of things being pervasive, like booze, there's a pervasive stupidity, I think, that also coexists with these choices that we make, where the obvious is there, but you find these excuses around it to not make the decisions that you need to make, like with the drugs, for instance. So, not let's leave booze in its own category. With drugs, I don't know how many times I overdosed, and I'm talking about overdoses where you think I might die. And
Yeah.
I was rarely hospitalized, but there were the times where you might have a friend around you or a couple of friends around you, and you know that you are clinging on to life only through them getting you up and walking you around, putting you in the shower, making sure that you're still breathing, waking you up every couple of minutes to make sure that you're not slipping away. I'd had quite a few of those in
Yeah.
my life. But again, step by step, the extreme ends become more normal. It's just like, oh my God, I had a massive night on the pingers. And then you're laughing about it within a few days, even though at the time it was so terrifying. It was so terrifying. But once you've given up, of course, it's always a last time. And
Yeah.
the last time is great to sort of reflect on because it's so definitive. So the very last time for me with that was I was back up in Brisbane. So I was a broadcaster for at this time, but I'd gone back up to Brisbane to see my family. My daughter, I'm not sure how old she would have been at that stage, maybe 7, 8. She was with her godparents, so she was always cared for, safe outside of all of this stuff. But then when I was, off the leash from parenting, because that space was like, this is where I behave, this is where I might only drink, not take drugs around her. Then it was, of course, it was sort of like that binge drinking mentality or that binging mentality. Oh, I haven't done this thing for 5 days. Great, I've earned a 3-day bender. So very much like that from the mother perspective. And my friends from LA were out here, international, amazing band. And when they were out here, that meant big times. And we'd gone out that night, lose track of time as you do, lose track of the amount of drugs that you've taken, and was at a club in the valley, all enclosed, no windows, no idea what time it is at all. And then remember taking the last pinger, which it might have been, I don't even know, like, but there was many, many taken that night, and they just start to do nothing. So it's like, all right, let's have one more. And I remember this moment of taking that one more, then I felt like 1 minute later, I heard that dreaded phrase that when you've just taken another pinger, you do not want to hear, which is the bartender calling last drinks, which means it's about 5:45 in the morning at
Yeah.
that stage when clubs were open till 6. And I was like, oh my God. And all of a sudden, you are in reality. It's not this world anymore where it has no time, it has no light, it has nothing else. It's last drinks, it's daylight outside. And my mate who I was doing this with, he had to fly back to LA at 8 a.m. And I was just like, oh my God, I know. Anyway, and I'm thinking about his flight. Can you imagine? And you probably, because of your international travel, probably can relate to some pretty horrible drug flights. I'm thinking about him and just going, oh, this is you. I'm going to have the shittest time ever, but I'm laughing. And then anyway, so we had to go home. There was nothing else. So nothing else open, nothing else to do. So I go home, and because of the quantity of alcohol that I had drunk, I passed out. But then the pinger must have kicked in, the last one. And I remember waking up and just sitting bolt upright, and I can't breathe. I'm like clawing at my throat, and my chest is completely stuck, and I've just gone over that capacity of tolerance. I can't breathe. I'm clawing at my friends are all asleep everywhere next to me, and I'm clawing at them. We're at a mate's house, and I'm like, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I'm not speaking, of course, but this is my
Yeah.
thing. And anyway, one of them who hadn't been out with us that night, he gets up. He gets me up and he's got me in the shower, and I'm obviously taking some air in, but I can't. I can't feel that, and so I'm passing in and out of consciousness with this lack of capacity to get in the oxygen that I need, and I'm freaking out, and then I'm passing out, and then I'm coming to. It was horrible, absolutely. Oh, I can viscerally in my body, I can still feel it to this day, and that was so long ago, 20
Yeah.
years ago. Now, probably from that, well, it would have been 19 years ago. The drugs went first before alcohol went.
Yeah.
So then he got me up, got me walking around, and I remember just being in these parks in Brisbane, and there's these people in their 60s, super conservative, walking their dogs at like it's probably 7 o'clock in the morning by this stage, and here's me, and I'm you know pissing in the bushes and vomiting and freaking out. Anyway, he drives me to the hospital, and he's like, I can't manage this. This is too far. And so we get to the hospital, and we just spent the time in the car then, and I think just seeing the hospital calmed me down enough to know that I would be okay. Anyway, we went in, and they were admitting me, and I was like, I cannot be here. I can't be here. Because all of a sudden I realized the time, and I realized that my daughter was going to be dropped home to me at 2 p.m. that day.
Yeah.
If I get admitted, I have no control anymore of when I'm going to come out, and I cannot be in here when it's time for my daughter to be dropped back to me. But the deeper narrative was, I'm going to die, and I'm going to die of a drug overdose. And my little daughter, I'm going to cry just talking about it. Isn't it funny all these years later how these things can just bring up
Mm.
still just such a strong emotion, even when you've told the story. I have told this story before, so it's not new, but not for a long time. But the further you get from those times, the more you see those times for what they were. And all as I could think was, I'm going to die. And this is going to be my daughter's story for the
Yeah.
rest of her life, is that her mum died of a drug overdose. It doesn't matter that I'm a national broadcaster on Triple J. None of that matters. It doesn't matter that I loved her so much that in the end, what I chose was drugs over her. And that was going to be the narrative for my daughter for the rest of her life.
Yeah.
And that was the last time that I took amphetamines or I took drugs.
Right.
The drinking hung around for a bit longer, quite a bit
Yeah.
longer after that. But that was the big moment for me with drugs, where that was so clear and I was so on the edge. And for her, again, whether you call them recreational drug use or not, that could never, ever, ever be a possibility that was going to be my daughter's story.
Yeah. It's very powerful. It's very powerful. Do you think that it takes a moment like that? Well, I guess you can only talk about your own story, but do you think it takes a moment like that to give you the big enough emotional shift that you need to change, or do you think it can come through something else?
There's a lot of people who, and I know this from being a therapist for the last decade, specializing in this place, that there are a lot of people who aren't as stupid as me. And there are a lot of people who didn't have to go to the places that I went to. There are a lot of people who are more moderate than I was, and whose endings weren't this stratospheric, you know, burning through space and time type endings, who managed to just go enough's enough. But for them, I can't speak entirely, of course, for other people, but it's all relative to also sometimes how far you've gone. I think
Yeah.
there's a pretty common equation there, which is how far you've gone is often going to determine the drama of your ending.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but that doesn't mean that my feeling at my ending was necessarily any bigger than somebody's ending that looks a lot softer and a lot more dramatic than mine did, because it was relative to how far it felt like they went for them.
Yeah.
It's so highly individualized.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. 100%. So, um, that happens. The thing that I've picked up on, which I think people will be curious about, there's been a name change somewhere in there. Um, I don't know if it's connected to like all of this stuff, or it's something different. But what kinds of things have you done to like? Was it just that moment, and then you've just kind of gone about your life, and it's never come back in, or have you had to like work and do things and do therapy and change behaviors and patterns and all of that?
I definitely didn't need any further encouragement to not do drugs. And then also when I gave up booze, which was probably 6 or so years after that. Once I stopped, I stopped. Like there was lots of little stopping points in between, but the moment where it was very, very clear, I knew I wouldn't go back to those things. But then it was also a case of, well, they're big things that consume a lot of space. So what's going in the spaces? With the drugs, probably what went in the space was more alcohol.
Yeah.
The alcohol kept all of that feeding the bigness of my personality that I talked about before. It allowed me to feel at my edges, to
Yeah.
be, whatever. But then when the alcohol went, that was the kind of the big moments where it was like, well, that's huge. It consumes so much more of your life than just the times where you're drinking. There's also dealing with the hangovers. There's what booze are you going to be drinking? What are you taking to this party? When are we stopping at the bottle-o? Do we have any mixes? There's so many other little bits and pieces of it that make it so much more pervasive than just the consumption of the alcohol itself. So what was going to go in the spaces? And it was so interesting again. I don't know what it is about this conversation with you, Jack, and why this kind of intersection of meeting you and speaking with you has kind of come at this, or has brought about this, right? Like now there's these other parts that I not only want to share, but also these other realizations. Like just this morning I was down the beach having a swim, and I love the ocean. And it occurred to me, because I always talk about yoga filling the space, which 100% has been my framework. And I'm not talking about just going into yoga postures. Like that's one tiny part of it. It gives a framework for living. There's the philosophy components. It's what is my relationship with my breathing, and then how does that connect to my nervous system and my mental health. And there's meditation, which is sharpening the axe of my mind. It's so big, which is why for so many people, when they're giving up drugs and alcohol, it can fill into that space. But before this morning, when I was down the beach and I was in the ocean, I realized that one of the first things that started to shift my relationship with alcohol, where I would for the first time have the thoughts the night before, don't drink as much tonight because
Sorry, everybody, we disappeared into the Zoom universe, I call it, the black hole of the Zoom universe. So the question I wanted to ask, and the thing I'm interested in off the back of all of that, you obviously had that massive realization. For you, was it just that? Was that just enough to help you to kind of stop, or was there a bunch of work that you had to do on yourself and your life to kind of get things moving in the right direction and change things up?
Yeah, like I think with the drugs, 100% that was enough. When it came to the alcohol, which was, you know, the 6 years later before I gave that away, there was such a big void there. And like I say always to my students, one thing that just cannot be left there is a hanging void. The void is just so very dangerous. I mean, there's that space, like something has to go in there, and something has to go in there that's bigger than the thing that you were doing. And I always say that, you know, yoga is that big thing that filled that space. But that realization that I was coming to, I was talking about that I had this morning down the beach, was when I was in the ocean, that one of the first things that started to naturally, without me intending to, dissolve my relationship with alcohol was surfing. Whereas I'd never surfed before. I became a surfer in my late 20s when I was living in Sydney. So it's kind of at the height of all of this crazy, amazing life and times that also came with all of these very unhealthy and harmful behaviors. But I knew I needed something. I've always been physical. I've always needed things, you know, I've always needed to be in my body. I've always needed to be active to get this big energy, you know, focused in some way. And when I moved to Sydney, I couldn't find the edges of the city. You know, like you walk through Sydney and you can't even find a green space, couldn't even find a blade of grass. And I was really feeling that. And the edge that I could find was the ocean. And growing up in the western suburbs, surfing was not something that was like what the rich coastal, the Skeggs did, like not us bogans from the west. And but I was like, I dreamed of that, you know, I dreamed of that as a possibility. So I decided that I was going to start surfing, and that got me absolutely hooked. And it was only this morning that I remembered it was the first time in my drinking career that I remembered whilst I was out the nights before at gigs and at different things, going, let this actually be a last drink because the waves might be good tomorrow.
Yeah.
Which is so fucked when you think about it. Like, I had a child at home. You know, why wasn't that enough? I would have a hangover the next day that would absolutely brutalize me. Why wasn't that enough? But for whatever reason, being a bit shit in those spaces also felt kind of normal. But it took something like that I felt passionate about in a different way that was new. I think
Yeah.
it was the newness of it that was important. So surfing really filled a space. I I left, I'd already left Sydney, so I changed my location. I was trying to unwind myself from the music industry because it was just taking me away from my family too much.
Yeah.
And so I changed my job, I changed my location, met a new partner who's still my partner today. We got married, hence the name change. I took on his last name. I wanted to explore how that felt as quite a strong, independent woman. And I still struggle with that today, but that's okay.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to be Mel Turner because it sounded like I was captain of the, I don't know, Australian women's rugby team or something. And
No, it doesn't. Okay.
so my family always called me Lissie, and I was like, Lissie Turner is way better. So there were definitely all those other elements to the name change as well.
Yeah.
And I realized that if I was going to make these big sweeping changes to my health and to my body, I had to do it full time.
Yeah.
So that's why I became a yoga teacher, and that's why I became a yoga therapist, because I didn't have time to do it on the side. And I like to do things at, you know, the most full on level that I can. So we built a yoga school, and we went for it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, I know what you're saying about the different elements of your life changing, like your name and the things that you're interested in and stuff like that. But what it sounds like kind of happened, or the process, is that you shifted your identity and like really kind of changed how you thought of yourself, and your relationship to the rest of the world. Correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, like it's interesting. It's like one of the patterns that I see when I talk to people. There's like a different vehicle, whether it's like trauma therapy or counseling or fighting, like martial arts or whatever. I don't know, whatever. But there seems to be some sort of like identity shift that happens for people that helps them to change. I don't know if you agree or not, if that's what kind of has happened with you, but yeah, it's what happened
And,
to me.
and it's also, don't you think it's one of the things that keeps people trapped in what they're doing? Because that change of identity can feel really, really scary. Like, who am I going to be without drinking? Who am
Yeah,
I going to be if I'm not Mel Bampton on Triple J, who parties like an absolute beast? Like,
yeah,
who am I going to be without these things? Who am I going to be if I change my location and I don't live in Bondi and I live in the Northern Rivers? Who am I going to be? What is that going to mean? Am I
yeah,
going to be less than? And so all of these little elements that we hold on to so tightly, that beautiful expression that I say time and time again from George Lucas, and which is, we're all living in cages with the doors wide open. And I always relate that back to the cage of self-identity,
yeah,
where we've got this cage that we've built around ourselves. And then when that's challenged, or even when we ourselves are considering shifting that, we can sometimes close the door and build more bars. Like, no, no, this is who I am. This is what I believe in. This is what I wear. This is what I say. This is who I vote for. This is what I drink. This is what I eat. Blah, 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 blah. And all of that stuff, every time we do that, we're just reaffirming the bars in that cage. And things that take up so much of our identity and time, it can be really scary to let those things go. It's almost like we have to free fall for a while, but the necessary element is trust. And I don't even you might have something outside of you that you trust in, like something bigger than you. You might have a spiritual perspective, and you can have a God concept, or you can have a pure intelligence concept, or even just this, magical aspects of science that are still beyond measure or whatever. Like, to me, that doesn't even matter. The most important thing that matters is to be able to just trust. You
yeah,
might just trust you that you, as a person who's survived every single thing that's crossed your path to this point in time, you've done that. Even if what you have to trust is you, just trust so you can free fall for a moment whilst as you're falling, you are looking around curiously, forming this new identity that hopefully is an identity that's not tight.
yeah,
Like, it's all about, well, how can I continue to be ever shifting, ever changing, so I don't just fall into a new cage of tightness, like, i.e., I'm now Lissie Turner, yoga teacher, yoga therapist. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I do this. I only wear these tights. I only whatever, because that's just another cage that, even though it's a much better cage than the ones I've lived in the past, I don't want to live in a cage. I want
yeah,
to keep expanding, and I want to keep seeing, and I want to keep growing and just seeing what else is out there, so that whoever stands in front of me, I can, through this elasticity of my own identity, I can be with them however they need me to be,
yeah,
because I'm not holding on to the tightness of my identity. Instead, I can go, who are you? What do you need? What do you need from me? And
yeah,
I can meet you there.
yeah. So interesting. And that's kind of what I wanted to ask you. I love all those analogies and how you explain it. So you have a program called Dissolving Patterns, I believe. Tell me if I'm wrong. But
Yep.
and it's not just about alcohol and drugs. It's about whatever it is that you might want to shift and change. and you mentioned that you've been working with people and helping people for a number of years now. Like, where do you start with people? Like, where do people start if they want to start to make some changes and some shifts? Where do you sort of recommend that people start their journey of change and making different decisions and behaviors and all that kind of stuff?
Well, the first thing is I need to meet them, and
Yeah,
because I need to meet them. Like, who are you? Where are you? What are
yeah,
your thoughts, your feelings, your obstacles, your dreams? I don't need to know all of your traumatic backstory. If you want to share that with me, great. But I don't also need to know all of those bits and pieces, because they just tend to come out in the wash as they need to or as they don't need to. What's presenting in terms of your symptoms? Like, what is actually causing you trouble right now? What does that look like? Is it that your relationships are suffering? Is it that there's injuries and imbalance presenting in your body? Like, what are the biggest obstacles? And let's start there. Like, oh, yes, great, you drink, you do that, whatever. Of course, that's a problem. You already know it's a problem. I don't need to tell you that that's a problem, because otherwise you wouldn't be here going,
yeah,
I need to change this stuff. And like you said, it might be things that are obvious, like booze or drugs, but it might be, the way that somebody talks to their partner. It might be the way that they get angry at their children, and then that breaks their heart because they don't want to do that,
yeah,
but they're caught in those loops of suffering. It's like, okay, what are your obstacles? Great, we're going to tackle those. And that might mean for someone, for every person who sees me, like if they're seeing me in a consultation, every single person will get their own prescribed practice, which will have elements of conscious movement to the level that is appropriate for them.
yeah,
Some people are, and I mean appropriate in terms of somebody might be capable of great strength, but they might actually just need to just chill out. Their practice could look like rest and relaxation, because their nervous system has been in hypervigilance for 20 years. And so, all right, we're going to start there. So they'll get, movement will be a part of it. And the reason for that is because nothing that happens in the mind escapes the body. So whatever you've been through, every little thing that you've ever thought, ever endured, lands in the body.
yeah,
It can't escape, because mind is in every cell. So, all right. And what's the easiest way to access the mind? Is through the body. So if somebody's like in this kind of really elevated state, they might be clean now, but they might have taken amphetamines for years. And so they're quite hyper state in the way that they are in their body, and because it's all landed there. All right. So we need to focus on bringing that down, but I'm not then just going to sit you in meditation and say, you need to focus on this thing and sit still, because they're
yeah,
going to feel like they're going to explode.
yeah,
And all right, well, we're going to move your body to the fullest extent that we can move your body, and we're going to land you back in your body, and through your body we can access your mind. I always form some relationship with the breath,
yeah,
so they can start to get a handle on being in command of your own life and your own responses to things, because the breath and the mind are in direct relationship with each other. So, and the nervous system. So if you can have command of your breathing, no matter what situation presents, if you can keep your breath calm and smooth, essentially you are then in command of telling the mind that everything's fine.
well, and it brings you into the moment, right? Because you're focusing on your breath, so that you kind of are where you are at that time.
Well, it's the most important part of your constitution, is your respiration. You're
Yeah,
not much without that. So
yeah,
as soon as you bring that consciousness to the breathing, so you move it from being involuntary to voluntary, the mind is like, oh, what do we do? Hang on, what's happening with this most important part of the constitution? And then if you have the capacity to, say, not just do a nice good round of breath, but also have a small hold between the breaths. So you take a little pause between the breaths. The mind's like, what's happening? The breath has paused. Okay, good. My person is choosing to pause the breath, but the mind is there because the respiration, which is the most important part of the constitution, has paused for a moment. So it will rush straight to that point. And exactly like you said, I'm right here, I'm right now. So what's next? So forming that relationship with the breathing. And but the tools can look so vast, which is what, again, I love about being a yoga therapist, which essentially means that I'm a therapist, but what I use for my tools are the smorgasbord of yoga.
Yeah.
So movement, visualization, sound, breath,
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
philosophy, all of those things. So there's definitely no one starting line for all people. It's what is presenting for you, what's the greatest and most significant obstacle that we need to address as the number one, and what are the tools that we're going to use to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. And I really dig this concept of, and I hope it's kind of what you're saying, but I'm fascinated by it. You know, if you think about like drinking and stuff like that, I've seen models of care for like troubled youth programs and things like that, where they kind of acknowledge that substance use is an issue, but it might not actually be that person's kind of biggest issue. And when you actually like focus on the problem that the person wants to take care of and start to shift and change, then it kind of naturally then transcends some of the substance use stuff, because that substance use stuff is more about escape. Yeah, so I love that kind of concept of going from the bottom up rather than just kind of focusing on like the symptom that is presenting itself. It's really interesting. It's really interesting. Yeah.
And I couldn't agree more. And often, someone will say to me, oh, I want to get rid of the booze or drugs or whatever it is. And I'll be like, great, how much are you drinking or how much are you using? And then that just gives me a gauge of what could be, how I could support them in their body. So I know, all right, that their liver's under this much load, their kidneys are under this much load. If they're smoking, all right, we've got to focus on the lungs. Those things are all important. So I can really specifically tailor the program. But then generally I'll say, great, good, don't worry. Just put that over there. You know that already. Like clearly, whatever. We don't really need to focus on that. So the dissolving pattern's the most distinctive thing about it from most other programs, is that the focus is not on getting rid of even that thing. And a lot of the time it's not even focusing on what's underneath that thing, but it's focusing on, well, where do you want to be going? Like what actually makes your heart sing? Like, what do you love doing? What do you love doing? Like, and I'm not just talking about, oh, I love surfing or I love yoga or I love painting, or those things are so important. So very, 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 very important. Absolutely. But what about, I love hearing my kids laugh.
Yeah.
I love when I get to see the sunrise from the right side of the day, the right side of bed, not because I've been up all night. Or I love seeing the sun set over this particular place in my life. Like, what about all these little tiny bits and pieces? Like, make note of all of those things. And we spend so much time in this beautiful, wild human life diminishing all of that stuff instead of putting it to the top. All right. So they're the things that you love. All right. Let's do more of those things. Let's do more of that. What makes your heart sing? Let's do more of that. Because I guarantee if you do more of that, that other stuff, which you can't take away, like say somebody's got this really polarized moment in their childhood and they're just stuck there. They're stuck there in this time in their childhood. But I guarantee if you shift the energy over, well, what does make your heart sing? What makes you feel alive? What makes you, when you go to bed at night, feel at peace because you spoke in this way, or you nurtured this thing, or you did this, or whatever it is? That other stuff, it doesn't leave you. It's part of your tapestry, but it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Then I encourage people to go, all right, well, they're the things you love, but in terms of where you want to be going, like what's a really big picture of that? Like, where would you just love to be? Like, who would you love to be? Like, I want to be a really strong, steady, centered 50-year-old woman, which is only in December. So I've still got a shit ton of work to do between now and then. And there's things way beyond that. I want to be surfing all the time, or whatever it might be. Someone might say, oh, you know what, Lissy, and like this is after chatting for half an hour, and eventually they'll say, I want to run a marathon. I actually really want to run a marathon. That's crazy. It's crazy. Like my knees are fucked, my hips hurt, whatever. Like I haven't even run to get the mail, in like 20 years. But there's this thing in them they really connect to. And it's like, all right, well, what do we need to do between where you are right now and there? These are the things that I can help you with. I can help you regulate your breathing. I can help you form this sense of really deep endurance because you can steady your breath, and we can improve all of that lung capacity by the way that we create greater elasticity in your rib cage and in your upper back. I can help you with your knees. Well, you've got to do the work, but I can support you in that. All right, you need to get strong calves. You need to get strong quadriceps for that. What else do you need? Oh, you need time to be able to train a little bit each day. All right, well, where can you find time? Are you scrolling for an hour a day? Well, why don't we stretch and run for an hour a day instead of scrolling, or half? Reduce that down to half an hour of scrolling, half an hour of training. And then what else do we need? So you get this big goal and you start to pull that all apart into all of the little parts of it until they're in little tiny bite-sized things. Oh, right, if I'm going to run a marathon, I might need to eat a better breakfast than what I'm currently eating now, which is coffee and a durry. All right, well, why don't, instead of thinking about giving that stuff up, you just eat whatever's going to be healthy for you each day. And then that's all the things then start to feed this red pin on the map, which is that bigger goal. And the other stuff, it just falls away.
Yeah.
It just falls away. And then
Thanks
5 years, sorry, you go.
No, you go. 5 years.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and then, 5 years down the track, you might not be yet running a marathon, but you look like this. And then you're looking back and you think, when did that other stuff fall away? I don't even know. I don't even know when it fell away because I'm so focused to where I actually want to be going.
Yeah, yeah. No, thanks for explaining it, because that's like, I'm glad that you did, because a lot of the time we talk to people and that's some of the feedback that we get from people, is that like we do people's story, we talk a little bit about, but we don't go too much into like, well, what does it actually look like? I hate this word. I don't know what other word to use though. Recovery, or just what does the change process look like? What does it involve? And because you hear all the time, like, you got to do the work, and people are always like, well, what's the work? What is
What's
it?
the
Like,
fucking work?
Yeah.
What is the work?
What do I do? Listen, you're an absolute star, mate. I could talk to you all day. I genuinely mean this. There's something about the last two times that we've chatted that I've just thoroughly enjoyed. It's been a bit of a fresh perspective for me, for someone that talks about this stuff all day. It's been really nice. So I appreciate that. And it's made me think about a lot of different stuff. Where can people find you if they're picking up what you're putting down?
If they on Instagram, either as Lissie Turner or the Prana Project,
Yeah.
which is the Regen Project, but it's not just a Regen project. It's a environmental and mental health initiative.
Yeah.
That when you re-engage people back in caring for country, you improve mental health. But you can find me through the Prana Project or through Lissie Turner. And I just want to say, Jack, too, that I know that you hear this stuff all the time, but that you can be somewhere where this stuff can land for other people is just so invaluable. And I don't say that lightly. I've been doing this stuff for a long time. I was a trash bag for a long time, and I've talked about that as well for a long time. But there's something about not feeling bad. So I hope it hasn't been too uncomfortable for you.
Not at
But
all.
not feeling bad about going, this is the gross parts about me and my past, or these are the things that I feel terrible about, but I hug them now too, and that I can share them with you. and not walk away feeling bad that I did that to you.
No, well, it's been our pleasure to have the space to allow you to do that. And don't worry, it's I know people say this all the time, but it's like I've done all that shit as well. So I get it. I get it. Sorry if we freaked anyone out listening, but deal with it.
Sometimes it feels like when you share a certain aspect of yourselves and you can see people, their eyes widening and they're going a bit pale, and you go, oh, it's almost like you may as well have vomited on them. And I love people who can handle the big stories as well as the delicate moments, and you're a bloody absolute star.
Thanks, mate. I appreciate it. Do you know what I have to be careful about sometimes? Because I forget, like, because I'm used to my mates and talking to people like you. Sometimes, because the way that I've dealt with it, and I don't know everyone out there listening, I don't know if it's the same, but um, like it's been through like black humor and just like laughing at really fucked up stuff, And sometimes I laugh in like professional settings and things when people say really like tough things in their life, and then I go, oh, holy shit! I'm not around my friends.
But it's first line of defense, right? Like, and it's
Yeah,
the best line of defense. And I use this really cheesy expression all the time, but the smile as the sword. Like when things are
yeah,
getting too dark, too hard, the mind's misbehaving and carrying like an absolute douchebag. It's trying to bring you down. The smile or the laughter at that stuff all of a sudden makes it small and makes you big again. And not laughing at people, of course, but when
yeah.
you've walked some juicy roads and you've come out the other side and you're just absolutely brimming with gratitude for good health and good people, and every day being alive is like, yes, I'm fucking alive. And it's easy to laugh at some of the darkest parts of your own story, and sometimes other people close to you as well, because they're your mates.
100%, 100%. Thanks so much again. I'll link all the details in the description. People, have a lovely day, and peace, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Jack.